How many people died in the Islamic conquests? You've probably seen people throw out numbers like they're reading a scoreboard. Millions. Tens of millions. Hardly anyone. And the comment section turns into a war zone. But here's the thing. The sources don't give us a clean total. Renowned Muslim historians like al-Tabari preserve dramatic stories and sometimes enormous numbers. Al-Baladhuri, a 9th century Muslim historian, preserves surrender deals, treaties, and the nuts and bolts of takeover. Byzantine chroniclers like Theophanes describe imperial disaster. Armenian tradition like Sabios remembers shockwaves on the frontier. Syriac chronicles focus on what it felt like to live through it. So tonight, we're going to do what most internet arguments don't do. We'll slow down and do it properly. And stay with me. Because later I'm going to translate the most responsible estimate into a modern-day scale comparison, using today's population across the conquest footprint, and it will sound very different. Welcome to Middle East History Channel. Today we're answering one question. How many people died during the Islamic conquests? We'll answer this in a way you can actually trust. 3 parts. Why there's no single official number. What happened region by region? Because the experience in Syria is not the same as Egypt and not the same as Iran. Then we will conclude with a careful, honest range, not a magic exact figure, and what that range means in today's numbers. Let's start with why there's no single official number. Let's be real. Pre-modern wars don't come with spreadsheets. No modern casualty lists. No standardized reporting. No universal censuses. And even when numbers appear, they often behave like storytelling tools, not measurements. The 10th century Muslim historian al-Tabari is incredibly valuable, but he's compiling traditions long after the first wave of conquests. That means he preserves memory, and memory can get bigger, cleaner, and more heroic over time. Al-Baladhuri often preserves something different, not epic battle numbers, but the paper trail of takeover, deals, taxes, surrender terms, protection agreements. And modern historians like Walter Kagi basically tell us, be careful. Medieval battle figures are often inflated, sometimes wildly. If an army size doesn't fit the roads, food, water, and supply limits of that world, the number should set off alarms. So instead of trusting one big number, we triangulate. What do different sources say? What does the landscape allow? What would an early medieval army realistically look like? And what patterns of surrender versus siege do we actually see? Here's the upgrade that changes how you hear everything else. Al-Tabari and al-Baladhuri aren't doing the same kind of history. Al-Tabari gives you the giant narrative. Commanders, turning points, dramatic confrontations, speeches, betrayals, hero moments, the stuff that makes conquest history feel like a movie. But because he's preserving later traditions, that same narrative style can carry big, dramatic numbers that work as moral theater. Al-Baladhuri is often the opposite vibe. He's like, who negotiated? What were the terms? What happened to taxes? Who gets protection? Where are garrisons placed? So if you only listen to al-Tabari, conquest can sound like non-stop gigantic battles and oceans of blood. If you only listen to al-Baladhuri, conquest can sound like treaties, paperwork, and power sliding into place. The reality is, both are true in different places and moments. There was fighting, there were sieges, there were deals, there were surrenders, there was violence, and there was administration. And this matters, because death toll arguments often pick one genre of source and pretend it's the whole story. One more thing before we march across the map. The conquest hit a region already battered. Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire had just burned through decades of grinding war. That drains manpower, money, and stability. So when provinces fall fast, it doesn't always mean nobody resisted. Sometimes it means the state was already cracked. This is also why blaming every population shock on conquest is dangerous. Late antiquity had war, famine risk, and disease outbreaks too. History doesn't hand us clean cause and effect labels. Before the conquests outside Arabia, there's the Ridda Wars, the consolidation phase. In later accounts preserved by Al-Tabari, this becomes the story of authority being reforged after Muhammad's death. Who pays taxes, who obeys, who breaks away, and what the new state does about it. And for our topic, the big point is this. Even here, no clean death totals exist. But the fighting mattered because it created a state capable of sustained campaigns beyond the peninsula. Now imagine you're a city leader in Syria. You hear an army is coming. You have walls, but supplies are limited. The empire is exhausted. Reinforcements might not come. Do you fight, or do you negotiate? Al-Baladuri preserves lots of moments where cities surrender under terms: tribute, guarantees, protection agreements, administrative continuity. That doesn't mean it's nice. It means this isn't automatically a story of every city being massacred. Syria and Palestine are a patchwork. Battles in some corridors, negotiated takeovers in others, and a lot of local variation. Yarmouk is the iconic battle, the one people point to like it explains everything. Later narratives sometimes imply enormous armies. But historians like Walter Kagi argue that a lot of medieval battle statistics don't match what Byzantium could realistically field and supply in that situation. And Fred Donner, looking at early Islamic armies, stresses a hard reality. These forces are not unlimited. Early field armies are better imagined in tens of thousands at most, often less. So what does that mean for deaths? If armies are tens of thousands, then even a very bloody battle usually means casualties in the thousands to tens of thousands, not hundreds of thousands slain in a single day. So in the Levant, deaths likely cluster in three places: major battles, raids, and skirmishes in contested zones, sieges, because sieges kill through hunger, disease, and panic. But the surrender patterns you see in Al-Baladuri are a major clue. A lot of places changed rulers without turning into a wasteland. Again, not peaceful, not harmless, but not a single uniform massacre narrative either. In Iraq, conquest quickly becomes governance, garrisons, taxation, new power networks. Al-Tabari preserves dramatic turning points, major clashes, political moments, rivalries, and those are valuable. But here again, modern historians warn us not to treat later narrative style as accounting. What we can say confidently is that Iraq is a core theater, and from here the frontier opens into the Sasanian world. Iran's conquest is often told like one dramatic fall, but it's better understood as a process. Defeats, deals, shifting alliances, and a collapsing imperial machine. And this is where cumulative mortality can rise, because prolonged war creates multiple ways for people to die. Battle, siege, displacement, famine risk, enslavement, and breakdown of order. If there's any region that pushes estimates upward, it's this long Iraq-Iran front. Now we have to include the Kurds in Kurdistan, because you can't talk about this frontier without talking about the mountains. In the 7th century, the Kurds aren't a single centralized state in the way modern people sometimes imagine. The term shows up in later Arabic and Persian traditions as upland communities and tribal groupings across the Zagros and parts of Upper Mesopotamia. And here's the key: mountains change warfare. On open plains, conquest is often about big battles and big cities. In mountains, it's about passes, forts, seasonal routes, local knowledge, and control that comes and goes. So the violence pattern often looks like raids, ambushes, punitive expeditions, sporadic sieges, and cycles of revolt and repression. And here's why this matters for death tolls. Frontier violence can be real, persistent, and deadly, but it often leaves terrible statistics. A chronicle may just say, "The district was subdued." That can hide years of pressure. The frontier cycle is simple and brutal. A new power arrives and offers a deal, tribute for autonomy. Tension grows, higher demands, deeper administration, garrisons, interference. Rebellion flares, refusal to pay, attacks on routes, local resistance. Repression follows. Punitive campaigns, seizures, forced movement. And in the mountains, deaths are often indirect too. Herds taken, food stores burned, winter supplies disrupted, villages abandoned. That turns into hunger, exposure, disease. So Kurdish upland zones teach us something important. Silence in the sources doesn't automatically mean peace. Sometimes it means we don't have detailed records for long, grinding local violence. Egypt is where you really see why certainty is hard. Some narratives make the conquest sound dramatic and absolute. But modern scholars who focus on documentary and administrative evidence stress that in many areas, conquest can look like regime change and taxation more than mass slaughter, while still allowing for violent episodes at points of resistance and fortified sites. So again, no honest historian should give you one clean number for Egypt and pretend that settles it. North Africa is crucial because it often isn't a quick switch. It's drawn out and contested, campaigns over decades, shifting alliances, reversals. Even if no single battle produces a jaw-dropping death count, prolonged conflict stacks up human cost through repeated disruption, displacement, hunger risk, cycles of repression. This is one of the zones most likely to push cumulative deaths upward across the conquest century. In Iberia, the takeover can look fast in many accounts, helped by internal politics and fragmentation. But the deeper transformation is slow. Cultural change and conversion are not a light switch. Which brings us to a big misunderstanding that messes up a lot of conversations. People often mash three different things into one: military conquest, political rule, and religious conversion. But they're not the same. A region can be conquered and taxed without everyone converting, and in many places conversion is gradual over generations. So when we talk about the human cost, we have to keep the categories clear, or we end up arguing about different things without realizing it. Now, finally, let's talk numbers. So what's the estimated number? Here's what the sources do. Al-Tabari preserves traditions that can imply huge casualties. Conquest told at epic scale. Byzantine chroniclers like Theophanes describe catastrophe. Other traditions preserve shock and devastation. But modern historians like Kaegi warn us not to treat medieval casualty figures as verified statistics. And scholars like Donner point out that early medieval armies weren't unlimited, which puts hard limits on what casualties can realistically look like. So the responsible answer is a bounded range for violent deaths directly tied to warfare, battles, sieges, raids, across the main conquest century. A defensible bracket is roughly 200,000 to 1 million violent deaths across the major theaters, with a big warning label. Uncertainty is real, and experiences varied massively by region. And now, here's the promised make it feel real moment. Okay, here's the part that makes the scale click. Now, I'm going to translate that range into a modern-day equivalent, and it's going to sound completely different. Let's do a careful thought experiment using today's population across the areas that roughly match the early conquest footprint. Using World Bank 2024 population totals, the modern region called Middle East, North Africa, Afghanistan, and Pakistan is about 813 million people today. Then add key conquest-era edge zones from the west and the east, including Spain, Portugal, and major frontier regions in Central Asia and the Caucasus. Put together, that comes to roughly 951 million people today, basically 1 billion. Now, what does our conquest death estimate mean on that scale? We need one more step: proportion. Population estimates for the 7th century are debated, but serious reconstructions usually place the population across that conquest footprint in tens of millions, not hundreds of millions. So if we use an illustrative baseline of 30 to 50 million people back then, 200,000 deaths is about 0.4% of 50 million. 1 million deaths is about 3.3% of 30 million. Now apply that same share to today's number 951 million people. That gives a modern scale equivalent of roughly 4 million to 32 million deaths. Let that sit. Not because the past was everyone wiped out, it wasn't, but because in a smaller world, even a few percent lost through war, siege, and frontier violence can reshape societies for generations. And just to be crystal clear, this is not claiming precision. It's a scale translation, a way to visualize what hundreds of thousands can mean when the whole world was smaller and our records are incomplete. This topic stays explosive because history gets weaponized. Some inflate numbers to demonize. Others deny violence to protect identity. Serious history rejects both. Empires fall through force, people die, and the job is to reconstruct that honestly, with evidence, uncertainty, and restraint. Now I want to hear from you. What do you think is the most responsible way to talk about death tolls in pre-modern history? Should we avoid numbers completely unless they're verifiable? Or is giving a careful range, with big uncertainty labels, still better than leaving the field to propaganda? Leave your view in the comments below. If you value serious, evidence-based history of the Middle East, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. That will also massively help the channel to grow. The Middle East History Channel explores empires, borders, and the forces that shape the modern region. Thank you for watching.